I'm Philip Maldari. I'm very grateful to be joined from Massachusetts, where it's actually raining. Andrew's very proud of the fact it's raining. And he is the author of many books. I do want to promote the fact that his most recent book is just out in hardback, After the Apocalypse, America's Role in a World Transformed. Now, Andrew is probably no stranger to most of you. Andrew has been writing books for 25 years or so. He is co-founder and president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, where he is very active today. In the past, he is professor emeritus of international relations and history at Boston University. He is retired from the US Army, where he was a colonel, or still is a colonel. He graduated from the US Military Academy at West Point in 1969. He went to Princeton after that and went to Vietnam as a soldier from 70 to 71. Now, among his many books, I've just listed a few of them here. American Empire, The Realities and Consequences of US Diplomacy, that was published in 2004. The New American Militarism, How Americans Are Seduced by War, that was 2005. Washington Rules, America's Path to Permanent War, that was in 2010. And in 2020, just a year ago, The Age of Illusions, How America Squandered Its Cold War Victory. To put it in a nutshell, Andrew is a product of the military, and he knows the military inside out. And he also knows the diplomacy, or the lack thereof, that has essentially squandered America's role in the world by making the US into the policeman of the world. This is obviously what he has grown to comment upon. The United States, the sole remaining superpower after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and what happened after that. So again, I want to thank him for joining us. Andrew Bacevich, the author of After the Collapse, America's Role in the World Transformed. Andrew, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Oh, it's a privilege. I'm grateful.
So this book is in keeping with many of the themes of your previous books, but it's very much related to what we're seeing right now. And the COVID crisis, of course, is part of it, but also the Trump years and what happened there, and now the Biden administration. We're talking about America also deciding finally to leave Afghanistan. Now, this is so reminiscent of Vietnam and the decision to finally leave Vietnam that I can only think of parallels. And we're already thinking of how many of the advisors, translators, people on the ground in Afghanistan that are going to be left behind. But you're of the opinion that we probably should never have gone to Afghanistan in the first place. So give us a sense of what you're talking about here, after the apocalypse.
Well, I noted, just reading the papers last year, in the midst of all those catastrophes that you were enumerating, that the term apocalypse was coming into greater and greater use, that observers seemed to appreciate that there was something about the convergence of events in 2020 that made that moment radically different from anything else that we have experienced in our lifetimes, or maybe since the 1960s occurred. And so, I set out to write a book to try to figure out what all that might mean, and what it might mean with regard to America's role in the world as we go forward. My context in that regard was the post-Cold War era, as I've written in previous books. When the Cold War ended, the American establishment, not simply the political establishment, I think in many respects, the media and intellectual establishment, had concluded that we had won. We had swept the table. We were the answer to history's intentions. And that in particular, because we believed that we had achieved a level of military mastery, unprecedented military mastery, that going forward, we were going to call the shots. And all that fell apart in the wake of 9/11. And I think that 2020 confronted us with the results of our arrogance, of our hubris, and that's what I wanted to write about.
So when you say calling the shots, between 91, when the Soviet Union collapsed, and 2001, when 9/11 happened, 10 years of the US calling the shots. A lot of that time was the Clinton years. Clinton, of course, bombed the bleep out of Yugoslavia. But in general, it was sort of like the US was maybe throwing its weight around, but seemed to not be, well, you tell me, what was happening in those 10 years?
Well, I think the first thing that was happening, and here we have to reference Francis Fukuyama's famous essay about the end of history. The first thing that happened was that the American intelligentsia and the American political establishment, obviously not everybody, but the majority, the most influential voices, really had concluded that the outcome of the Cold War had decided something fundamental about the trajectory of human history. Something fundamental had been decided, and had been decided in our favor, that liberal democratic capitalism, as we understood those terms, would now define the future of human history. It seems ridiculous in retrospect, but during the 1990s, that was a notion that was seriously taken. Related, I think, was the concept of globalization, or its first cousin, neoliberalism. That there was a clear recipe for the future of the global economy that would make everybody rich, everybody would prosper. The possibility that substantial numbers of people would be left behind, and because they were left behind, they might just become angry and alienated, didn't seem to factor in. And then finally, there was the military dimension, the fact that we persuaded ourselves that we had the greatest military the world had ever seen. So in the 1990s, the prospect of permanent American global primacy seemed very clear. The path was clear. And of course, then we got to 9/11, which suddenly, reminded us that no path in history is clear. But we Americans, we the United States, and not necessarily you. I mean, not necessarily people who are watching this, but the country as a whole. We bought into a bill of goods that would cause terrible damage to ourselves and to others.
Well, I left out the 1991 Gulf War, which you were part of. You were there for that war. You were in the military at the time. And this was George Bush, the father, Colin Powell, the head of Joint Chiefs of Staff. And it was a quick war. It was a quick victory. It was get in, get out. And it, in essence, made a lot of people think that that this primacy of the US was in fact not good. It's going to be a no-lose situation.
I'm going to disagree with you a little bit.
Okay, well, go ahead.
In the sense that it appeared to be a decisive victory, but it was not get in and get out. Because when Operation Desert Storm ended, contrary to the expectations of the Bush administration, Saddam Hussein survived. So the chief problem, Saddam, the chief problem that the war was undertaken to eliminate, the problem was still there. And that mattered because, as a consequence, in response to his survival, the Bush administration committed the United States from that point forward to maintaining a very substantial military presence in the Persian Gulf. Now, we've forgotten this. Before 1990, we didn't have we had a trivial military presence in the Gulf. Since 1991, the Persian Gulf has been the focal point of American military activity involving, any number of wars and interventions. So on the one hand, it appeared that Operation Desert Storm was an unprecedented victory. And of course, that impression then reinforced the notion that we had achieved military supremacy. On the other hand, it really wasn't a decisive outcome. It wasn't a decisive outcome in a political sense. And war is about politics. It's not really beyond the issue of what happens on the battlefield. War is about trying to achieve a desirable political outcome. Operation Desert Storm didn't do that.
Well, of course, the next war didn't do that either, but there was, in the interim, Yugoslavia. And I think Clinton was hesitant at first to get involved. But ultimately, the US, with the prodding of the Europeans, bombed the bleep out of Beograd. And with that, there was a capitulation by the Serbs. And excuse me, and that was viewed as a desirable outcome because there had been a massively bloody war there, a civil war, civilian casualties, etc. Sarajevo being just decimated from artillery, and so it seemed like the U.S. could use its military might to save civilians and bring peace to a troubled land, or at least that was the hoped for outcome. What was your impression of that war?
Well, I think the Balkan interventions also. I think the description you just gave is largely accurate, but we deceived ourselves again. You remember the Kosovo War, 1999. We achieved our purposes. It took a lot longer than we expected. When the air campaign began, General Wesley Clark, the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, thought it would take 3 or 4 days to scare off the Serbs. It ended up taking weeks. Conflict ended with no US casualties. No Americans died in the Kosovo intervention, because it was an air campaign. And the result was, I think, to reinforce this notion of American military supremacy. Think, what the hell? All we need to do is bomb them. We bomb them, they'll give up, we'll declare victory, and we'll achieve our purposes. In other words, it furthered the misleading understanding of war that would then cause us great trouble, after 9/11.
So Madeleine Albright, who became, well, for a while she was our ambassador to the United Nations, and then she became Secretary of State. She's quoted, I guess she was on the Today Show on NBC, as saying the United States was the indispensable nation. There were State Department people that thought the Pentagon was risk averse. And Madeleine Albright was among the people that thought, why are we spending these billions of dollars for a military if we can't use them, if they don't want to fight? And so again, the US, the indispensable nation, and the State Department hawks that wanted to use that military for the purpose of American interests, as well as peace and justice and the American way, around the planet. You're not very kind to Madeleine Albright in your book.
Well, I don't want to pick on Madeleine Albright. I think actually she was expressing views that at that particular moment were in wide circulation in Washington in policy circles. I mean, indispensable nation is the offspring of the notion of American exceptionalism. You know, the belief that America has been chosen by God, chosen by providence, chosen by history, chosen by something to redeem the world. And you know, this theme has come and gone in our history. Sometimes American exceptionalism expresses itself not in the notion that we need to go bomb somebody or invade a country. Sometimes it expresses itself in the notion that we should be an exemplar, that we should provide the example for others to model themselves after. But in that moment after the end of the Cold War, modeling wasn't going to suffice. At that particular moment, the conviction that we possess supreme power persuaded people that we should coerce the world into aligning itself with our view of how things were supposed to be. And I think Albright was bore witness to that notion, but she was not alone. I mean, it was that notion of America as an indispensable nation was in wide circulation in the 1990s and continued to be in wide circulation after 9/11. I mean, I don't want, rather than picking on Madeleine Albright, I would pick on George W. Bush after 9/11, who justified what he called the global war on terrorism in terms of the United States now assigning itself the prerogative of engaging in preventive war pursuant to a grand scheme that would result in the democratization, liberation of large parts of the Middle East. I mean, it was madness. And yet, I mean, we can see today it was madness. But back in 2002 or into 2003, although there were people who opposed George W. Bush's military policies, it seemed to make a lot of sense. And what's the proof of that? The proof of that is that by 2006, he was elected to a second term. Seems preposterous, but it happened.
Well, I do want to get to that decade, but I don't want to leave the 90s behind. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, it meant all of those Eastern European, Central European countries were now free to, have elections and choose their governments. And I don't know if they gravitated towards NATO on their own or if they were coerced by the Western Europeans and the US to NATO, but in short order, they all signed up for NATO, as well as, ignoring the promise made by the George Herbert Walker Bush administration that NATO would not expand to the borders of Russia. We had the former Soviet republics on the Baltics, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, all join NATO because they wanted to be protected by the US from the Russians. So NATO, again, continued its role of allegedly protecting Europe from the Russians at a time when the Russians posed no threat. And you later in your book actually advocate the abolishment of NATO. That's in your last chapter. So let's talk briefly about what happened there.
Well, I don't know, Philip, maybe I've forgotten my own book. I don't think I advocate the abolition of NATO. What I do advocate is that the US should withdraw from NATO.
Okay.
In other words, that let's put it this way: the conditions that genuinely justified the creation of NATO in 1949 no longer exist. What were those conditions? 1949. Well, Europe was weak. Europe had been shattered by 2 world wars in a period of less than half a century. European economies were devastated. I think psychologically, Europe had been devastated. And so the Europeans needed support, needed security assistance. And at that time, the Soviet Union was a relatively formidable adversary. So when the Truman administration committed the United States to providing for the security of Europe by joining NATO, that was an act of enlightened statesmanship. Absolutely. Well, here we are in 2021. Soviet Union's gone. Russia, I believe, has a GDP equivalent to Italy's. Europe is prosperous, not without problems, but relatively united and fully capable of defending itself, against what is actually a fairly modest threat posed by Russia. My argument is let's allow Europe to defend itself for 2 reasons. Reason number 1 is we've got other things we should be concerning ourselves that are more important to the well-being of the American people than defending Germany and France and Belgium. And the second reason is this, and I think this is more important. From a geopolitical perspective, what is our aim? What is our purpose? I would argue that our purpose is to help to bring into existence a global order consisting of nation states that are generally liberal, generally democratic, and generally willing to live in peace with one another. And guess what? That's Europe. In other words, we have accomplished our mission there. And by declaring mission accomplished, by letting Europe manage its own affairs going forward, we would give the lie to the claim that the United States is actually interested in global empire. I mean, maybe we are interested in global empire.
I think there's a question about that.
But I would like us not to be interested in global empire and to demonstrate that by allowing the Europeans to manage their own affairs. Again, in part because there are many more important security issues that we should attend to that are far more important than defending Germany and Belgium at this point.
I do want to remind our viewers that they can leave questions. Why not do it at the chat? I'm looking, there's nobody currently contributing to the chat at the bottom of your screen. So again, I'll try to fit in your questions as well into this conversation. Andrew Bacevich is our guest. His latest book, just out in hardback, After the Apocalypse, America's Role in the World Transformed. It just came out 2 weeks ago, or 2 weeks ago or so. And I had a chance to read the edition, sort of the proofs a few months ago. And so I really just gobbled it right up. I really enjoyed every minute of it. I do want to suggest now that we move on to the 9/11 and what happened next. I I don't even know if the brand new Bush administration was totally incompetent at viewing intelligence that was, if you believe some, warning them in advance that something like 9/11 was about to happen, but they ignored that intelligence. But as soon as it did happen, clearly the people around George W. Bush saw it as a huge opportunity, an opportunity to do what they had wanted to do for some time, which was, as we saw, go and declare war on Iraq. Because as you already mentioned, that was sort of unfinished business when George the Father did not succeed in overthrowing Saddam Hussein. It's also curious to me, Saddam Hussein was somehow the enemy, when in fact, I thought Iran was the enemy. And the person that had fought Iran to a standstill was Saddam Hussein. So I'm still to this day very confused on why the folks around Bush focused on this and more or less claimed Saddam Hussein was a Svengali behind what happened on September 11th.
I think you put your finger on it when you use the term opportunity. Yeah, they ignored the signs that a terrorist attack was in the offing. Of course, it's always easier to read those signs in retrospect. In retrospect, it's not difficult to see the likelihood of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. But they missed the signs. But as you suggested, this was a horror, a catastrophe, a crime, and it was an opportunity. And I think that in particular, to people like Vice President Cheney, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz, they seized upon the opportunity. And the opportunity, the essence of the opportunity was that here now was the chance to put American military supremacy to work, to fix the Middle East, to eliminate the causes of the 9/11 attack. And the place to begin was Iraq. Now, Saddam Hussein was a bad guy. Saddam Hussein was a problem. Saddam Hussein was not anything remotely like a threat to US national security. Remember, 1991, we'd gone to war with Saddam Hussein and had thoroughly defeated his military in a period of about 4 weeks. But Iraq was the entry point into the region. Nobody was going to stick up for Saddam Hussein. So by targeting Saddam, by creating this fictitious story that he was involved in 9/11, would provide the opportunity to introduce very large-scale US military forces into the region, overthrow Saddam, and then, so they thought, install in Baghdad a new political order that would be stable, legitimate, sort of liberal, and aligned with the United States. Now imagine if we had done that in the spring of 2003. What would have been the response from Iran, Syria, Egypt, Saudi Arabia? In other words, what would have been the response to this demonstration of implacable American determination and enormous American military power? When George W. Bush's envoy went to Tehran and said, "Hey, gang, here's what we expect you to do from now on," what would they have said? The calculation in Washington was that basically the region would have done the sensible thing and would have accommodated itself to American demands. Of course, guess what? The campaign didn't work out as planned. Or to put it, more specifically, we got to Baghdad, we overthrew Saddam Hussein, but that liberal, stable, legitimate, democratic order never materialized. Instead, what we got was a protracted, ugly, unconventional war that depleted American military power and basically demolished the entire grand strategy that the inner circle of the George W. Bush administration had fancied that it was going to be able to implement.
I've been corrected. I've told people to go to chat. It's better to go to Q&A at the bottom of your screen to add questions to our conversation and not chat. So Q&A is where you can leave your questions for Andrew Bacevich. You really go after Colin Powell in a big way in this portion of your book. And again, the book we're talking about is just out in hardback, After the Apocalypse, America's Role in the World Transformed. He, of course, was Secretary of State, and as such, but he had been, chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He had been among the most reticent to get U.S. bogged down in a never-ending war. And yet his very famous speech in front of the United Nations, he is totally convinced and makes an argument that many people found quite convincing, that in fact Saddam Hussein was behind the attacks of 9/11, and that Saddam Hussein was in fact developing nuclear weapons, and that he went through the yellow cake coming from Niger. He went through the alleged bomb production. If you recall, Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor's line that she repeated over and over again, we can't wait for the smoking gun to become a mushroom cloud. She repeated that one over and over again. I think I mentioned to you before that you leave her sort of out of responsibility here, but I think you really focus on Colin Powell because you thought he should know better, given his history, and he apparently didn't.
Yeah, I didn't mean to go after him. I think he's a tragic figure. I think he was used by Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz. And I think the real tragedy is that, this is what I try to talk about in the book, is that as in his time, the most widely respected and powerful Black person in America, in American politics, somebody who was. I remember when Clinton was president. In some respects, Colin Powell commanded more respect than the president of the United States did. And my criticism of Powell is that after the Cold War, and in particular after Operation Desert Storm, he bought into if I can put it this way, he bought into what was in fact the white interpretation of what the end of the Cold War and Operation Desert Storm meant. So as a Black American speaking to audiences, he chose to affirm the claim that the end of the Cold War, Operation Desert Storm, had established American global primacy. And because of his enormous prestige, he invested those claims with greater authority. And it seems to me, and it seems to me now, in this particular moment where we are, this moment of racial reckoning, Black Lives Matter, that he wasted his prestige. He wasted his influence. He might have been somebody who could have at that time challenged the narrative of American global supremacy, might have suggested that there were other ways of looking at the evolution of history that might have allowed a greater role for people of color. He didn't do that. He played the game of the establishment. And when we get to the post 9/11 period, the Bush administration uses him and that basically kicks him to the curb, doing irreparable damage to his integrity, authority, prestige, standing in the eyes of the American people.
So we have to jump ahead in history. I'm looking at the clock. We've only gotten to 2006 or something like that. We've got Obama coming on the scene in 08, 09. And Obama actually had opposed the Iraq War, and he campaigned on getting us out of Iraq and getting us out of Afghanistan, both, I believe. You correct me if I'm wrong on that. And then when he got to the White House, things changed. Why did they change?
Well, I mean, I'll disagree with you a little bit. Yeah, he certainly campaigned on, elect me president, I'll get us out of Iraq. But he also said, elect me president and I will prevail. We'll win Afghanistan if you elect me. So those were the two sort of markers he had laid down. And he basically didn't achieve either of them. I mean, that is to say, what was it? We withdrew from Iraq in the end of 2011, I believe it was. But sadly, tragically, perhaps not, unexpectedly, the Iraqi state that we left was too weak to withstand the coming assault of ISIS. So Obama got us out of Iraq in order to turn around and get us back into Iraq again. And he escalated the US military effort in Afghanistan. We mostly forgotten that, but there was an Afghanistan surge that sort of mirrored the Iraq surge under George W. Bush. Great expectations that it was going to stabilize Afghanistan. Here we are in 2021, and we can't say what the future will bring for certain, but the outlook in Afghanistan is grim. The Taliban is clearly on the march. And so Obama didn't get it done. Now, why didn't he get it done? I think the answer is that his critique of the national security paradigm was insufficiently radical. That he was not willing to give up on the notion that American military power is the basic notion, idea, force that sustains U.S. global supremacy. So he was working around the edges, but he really didn't address the main problem.
So let's do some of the questions from the listeners. Mariella says, Andrew, I've been telling all and sundry for years that you're the best hope this country has for bringing us all together. Certainly the best informed and most intelligent. Please run for president or at least Congress. So you've got a fan with Mariella. Are you running for office? You're from Massachusetts. You're bound to get elected in Massachusetts, whatever you ran for. Okay.
I don't know about that, but thank you very much. That's very kind. I'm 73 going on 74. I think I'm a little long in the tooth to begin a political career at this point.
Oh, I don't know. Look at the rest of them.
Well, fair enough.
Look at the president.
Fair enough.
Okay. What do you think is the likelihood that Russia will engage in military action or invasion of the bordering nations, also the European nations beyond its borders?
Slim to none. I think it would be, Putin is brutal, but Putin is not stupid. I think Putin probably appreciates that by and large, Russia is in a relatively weak position relative to the rest of Europe. He needs to have relations with Europe that will help prop up the Russian economy. So there certainly will be saber rattling, but no, he's not going to invade Lithuania. Now, now the questioner may say, "Hey, wait a second. How about Ukraine? How about Georgia?" And it is true, and we need to recognize it, that Putin has a rather lively appreciation of a Russian sphere of influence. That is to say, he is not going to tolerate outsiders, NATO or otherwise, mucking around in what he considers to be Russia's neighborhood. And in that sense, let me simply say, his attitude is like every other great power's attitude. We forget our own history. 1960, 1961, Cuban Revolution. When the Soviet Union dared to forge an alliance with Fidel Castro's Cuba, we reacted rather harshly. Bay of Pigs tried to overthrow Castro. All kinds of dirty trucks trying to assassinate him, and thereby set in motion a sequence of events leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So yeah, great powers tend to be protective of the geographic area nearest to them, and I think that's what Russia that explains Russia's behavior in Georgia, in Ukraine. That doesn't mean that Russia is going to, invade the Baltic republics. I think that's highly unlikely.
So another question, this is, what about the role of Israel and American Zionists in promoting the debacle in the Middle East?
You want to get me in trouble? No, I think the answer is that the state of Israel, regardless of the government, in other words, this is not simply a comment about Netanyahu. The state of Israel had a very clear-eyed conception of what Israeli security requires. And the conception consists of at least 2 points. One of them is that the state of Israel needs to maintain an independent military capability far in excess of any of its likely adversaries. And the second thing is that the state of Israel needs to expand territorially beyond the boundaries that existed in 1948, both to provide for strategic defensibility and also to ensure economic viability. And that those twin purposes have driven Israeli policy from 1948 down to the present moment, in my opinion. I think where the United States has gone wrong, going back to the Kennedy administration, is blindly endorsing both of those, at least implicitly endorsing, not explicitly, at least implicitly endorsing both of those efforts without fully considering the possible impact on US interests in the region. So we have claimed to be an honest broker in the dispute between Israel and the Palestinians. We've not been an honest broker. We have sided with the Israelis against the Palestinians. And I think that the overall impact on US interests has tended to be negative. Sadly, given our domestic politics and the way our domestic politics works, and I'm not simply referring to the Israel lobby, but probably more importantly to the Protestant evangelicals who are committed to the state of Israel for religious reasons. I don't think there's going to be any. We're stuck. We're not going to get out of this complicated situation that we have brought upon ourselves.
Something else happened during the Obama years, and that was the U.S. Participation in the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. And initially, I gather that Obama wanted to stay out of it. Certainly, Biden wanted to stay out of it. Biden was pretty clear about wanting to stay out of it. But Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State, was very gung-ho. And of course, the US, along with the Western Europeans, the NATO allies, didn't put boots on the ground, but did everything they could. And ultimately, of course, we know what happened to Gaddafi. And then, of course, the anarchy that followed after that, assuming that we can drop a few bombs and then that'll solve the problem. And then, of course, anarchy, which is still with us today.
Right. and of course, we don't care. I mean, we collectively, the American people could care less about what happens in Libya. But I mean, is that not a classic illustration of good intentions gone wrong? I mean, I have no doubt that Secretary Clinton, Susan Rice, Samantha Power, I think those were perceived to be the three people who were leaning on Obama to intervene. We should not let Obama off the hook. He was the commander in chief, but nonetheless, three officials who perceived themselves to be idealists pressed for that military action. And it becomes a classic illustration of, unintended consequences that result from a military campaign. Have we learned anything from that? I have to say I'm doubtful, but there too, as in Afghanistan, as in Iraq, we created chaos, and it's a mess.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Samantha Power, who is now the head of USAID. And I interviewed her way back when, before Obama became president. It must have been in 2008. In any case, she's what's called a humanitarian hawk. She's the great humanitarian that's trying to save beleaguered, threatened people all over the world, and the use of military force for that purpose is absolutely on her agenda. So you already mentioned that Libya is a case study and how that is a disaster. Could you elaborate? Is it always the case? I mean, in Yugoslavia, what Serbia was doing to Kosovo, what was it, 4 weeks of bombing, and all of that came to an end. Was that a good war?
Well, I mean, I think it was closer to 8 weeks rather than 4 weeks. And we ended up bombing downtown Belgrade. If you remember, we ended up, an airstrike hit the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, which was a little bit of a embarrassment. I guess I'm in the school that is very skeptical about the utility of force. There is a school of thinking that I think is prominent in the U.S. military and prominent in the wider foreign policy establishment that says that with the advent of precision technology, that force itself becomes more precise, and that therefore we can use force and we can anticipate negative consequences. We can control for negative consequences. And there are people who would point to Kosovo and say, yeah, there's an example of how it worked. I would point to a whole bunch of other examples like Libya, like Iraq, like Afghanistan, to say that it doesn't work. And quite frankly, even in Kosovo, when the Kosovo War ended, the immediate result was ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, that the Kosovars forcibly expelled Serbs, I don't remember the number, 100,000, 200,000 Serbs living in Kosovo, forcibly expelled Roma living in Kosovo. So even that case, which can be sort of cited to justify humanitarian intervention, also involved the downside that, at least in the moral calculus, has to be considered. So I guess that's a long-winded way of me saying I'm just skeptical about the value of armed intervention, that it ends up costing more than people expect. It ends up yielding unintended consequences. And all the bright dreams of defending democracy and protecting human rights tend not to be fulfilled.
So you don't think there is such a thing as a good war or a justifiable war?
No, I don't. No, I'm not saying there are justifiable wars. World War II was a justifiable war. The World War in Europe was a justifiable war. There's no question about it. But I guess I'm in the camp that says there aren't a heck of a lot of justifiable wars, and one should view very skeptically the claims made by politicians that say, yeah, we need to go to war there. That's really, really important. That's doable, because the optimistic projections of the politicians, more often than not, don't pan out.
So in Biden's trip to Europe last week with NATO and the G7, he was obviously trying to get backing for them to help the United States confront China. And I don't think he's talking about a military attack on China, but he certainly is wants to be a foil to China pressuring Southeast Asia, pressuring Taiwan, making claims to the South China Sea, all the way up to Indonesia practically. And he wants European help, and they seemed a little hesitant to get on board because China's a long way from the North Atlantic, I guess. But what's your opinion?
That's my opinion. I mean, you just quoted President Macron, who said, hey, wait a second. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is about the North Atlantic. China is not in the North Atlantic. I mean, I think the politics of the situation was that Europeans are delighted that Trump is gone. Europeans want to do what they can to accommodate Biden in order to show that NATO is alive. But the notion that NATO is going to give any serious assistance to whatever the evolving situation in East Asia is absurd. Let us remember that since its creation in 1949, NATO has actually undertaken one, apart from defending Europe, that was the purpose of creating NATO, has undertaken one serious campaign, and that's Afghanistan. NATO has been involved in Afghanistan almost since the beginning of the Afghanistan war.
That's because they bombed New York City, or they attacked one of the NATO nations. And
No. You are correct that in response to 9/11,
yes,
NATO activated Article 5,
right,
and promised to come to the defense of the United States of America.
yes.
Intervening in Afghanistan is somewhat different. We've had NATO forces in Afghanistan for close to 20 years. You tell me how the Afghanistan war seems to be working out. My point is that NATO's Afghanistan mission has failed. Now, we think that NATO is going to provide assistance in responding to whatever threat is posed by the People's Republic of China. I mean, come on. It ain't going to happen. More to the point, the whole notion that we need to mobilize NATO against the People's Republic of China implies a militarization of our relations with the People's Republic that may well be inappropriate. I mean, not for a second am I apologist for China. Not for a second do I deny that they are an adversary. But the notion that we should define the US-China relationship in military terms strikes me as not a good idea.
So I'm neglecting some of our questioners. What Bob in Berkeley says, will a new government in Israel change anything?
No. I mean,
short answer is no.
No, I mean, I don't want to come across as an expert in Israeli politics, but I'm not. But I mean, the Naftali Bennett is a hardcore Zionist nationalist who has absolutely no interest in revisiting this notion of the two-state solution. It's my reading of Israeli politics, again, I'm not an expert, is that the right wing dominates politics, and therefore there is not a heck of a lot of support for anything like accommodation with the Palestinians. So I can't say that I'm particularly hopeful.
The US military budget is approaching $1 trillion a year. If that was cut in half, saving $500 billion to be spent on other needs, would the US be less secure with half as much money being spent on the military?
I think the real question here is, what are the security threats that we should be concerned with? And the Pentagon's answer is the number one security threat is the People's Republic of China. The number two security threat is Russia. The number three security threat is terrorism. I don't mean literally that's the way they stack it up, but as a practical matter. In other words, the definition of threat is stuff that's way out there, and that the United States military is designed to deal with things way out there, to project power. My argument is, well, no. Why don't we define national security, the focus of national security, as dealing with the things that threaten us where we live, here, right here in North America. What are those things? Well, guess what? Pandemics, climate change, border insecurity, et cetera, et cetera. So it could be that we should be spending $1 trillion a year on national security. that doesn't follow that we need to give all that money to the Army and the Navy and the Air Force. Maybe we should give it to the Federal Drug Administration. Maybe we should give it to the Coast Guard. Maybe we should give it to border security agencies. So again, the key point is, I think national security should focus primarily on providing for the well-being of the American people where they live. That should be job number one. And I think we've lost track of that. Basically, we lost track of that since the beginning of the Cold War.
So we're running over time, and I've let Donald Trump off the hook totally. I haven't even brought him up.
That's good.
Briefly, you actually agree with Donald Trump on several things, like getting out of these endless wars. What happened for 4 years of Trump?
Well, I mean, he was a fraud. He was an incompetent. He did say things from time to time that I could say, well, I agree with that. But he lacked discipline. He lacked follow through. He lacked sincerity. So he accomplished next to nothing with regard to a serious reorientation of national security policy. There were photo ops, going to North Korea and meeting with Kim Jong-un, that kind of stuff. But there was no serious effort to change direction. He was a failed president, a totally failed president.
Well, on that note, I guess it's too early to say a lot about Biden, but do you have one pithy comment before we say goodbye?
I think that obviously a well-intentioned guy, but a product of his own experience. How could he not be? He's an establishment politician. I see little evidence that he possesses the imagination to define the problems of the 21st century, much less to devise solutions to them. But early in his presidency, let's see how things play out.
Andrew Bacevich has been my guest. His book is just out, After the Apocalypse, America's Role in a World Transformed. I'd really appreciate you spending this time with us. And I know you're not doing a book tour, but whenever you get to the West Coast, you're coming to a wedding, but it's down in LA. Try to make it to the Bay Area. I'd love to have you in the studio, but no doubt I'll have you on the phone, on the air in the not so distant future. I thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.